Welcome to another explainer. You know, here we love taking primary sources and really breaking them down so you can literally see the mechanics of how the world works. Today, today we have a totally fascinating text to dig into. We're looking at the official remarks from a high-stakes open press moment that wrapped up a major state visit between the leaders of the United States and China. Think about it. When the cameras are rolling and the whole world is listening, how do world leaders actually communicate what they want? Today, we're going to see how they can take dramatically different approaches to get things done, all while sitting in the exact same room. Let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this. Just listen to these two quotes. They were spoken mere moments apart during the exact same diplomatic press event. On one hand, you've got this stark, super urgent declaration about international security. We don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. It's a crazy thing, right? Heavy stuff. But then, on the other hand, you have this serene, deeply personal offering. I've agreed to send the seeds for these roses to the president as a gift. I mean, think about that contrast for a second. We are bouncing from the literal threat of global nuclear proliferation to exchanging gardening seeds. How do these two totally different wavelengths even function within a single diplomatic dialogue? Well, that brings us to Section 1, Inside the Diplomatic Talks. Two distinct styles. And this brilliantly illustrates the thematic juxtaposition we're exploring today. By breaking down the transcript, we can really decode the architecture of modern diplomacy. Notice the stark divide here. The U.S. president's remarks fall heavily, almost entirely, into geopolitics and economics. The focus is completely on the direct and the transactional. He's talking about fantastic trade deals, the situation with Iran, the threat of nuclear weapons. It's direct and it is immediate. Conversely, President Xi's remarks anchored the completely opposite end of the spectrum. He focuses on history and symbolism, bringing up the year 1949, ancient imperial gardens, and yet, rose seeds. It's a communication style built on legacy, the setting, and really long-term continuity. So let's analyze that in a bit more detail. Section 2, the policy play, looking specifically at trade and the Iran question. As we look at the U.S. president's remarks, notice how energetic and problem-solving the rhetoric is. It completely matches his focus on immediate, high-stakes geopolitics. The transcript shows him directly addressing the Middle East, specifically Iran, and the priorities laid out are crystal clear. First, there is an explicit desire to end Iran's nuclear ambitions, stating simply, they cannot have a nuclear weapon. Second, an economic and strategic imperative, keeping the straits open for global transit. And third, noting the current kind of aggressive back-and-forth actions, stating that because the straits were closed, quote, we closed it on top of them. What's really notable here, especially in diplomatic terms, is just how candid the language is. The situation and the ambitions involved are plainly characterized right there in the text as a little bit crazy and no good. It's a very unvarnished, hard policy approach delivered right straight to the cameras. But beyond security, this hard policy approach leans really heavily on economics. The transcript highlights a massive emphasis on direct economic outcomes, with the U.S. president stating, we've made some fantastic trade deals. He actually frames the success of this diplomacy around problem solving, specifically noting that over their relationship, which he clocks at almost 11 to 12 years, they've managed to settle a lot of different problems that other people just wouldn't have been able to settle. So he's defining the strength of their relationship entirely through the lens of transactional success and mutual respect forged at the negotiating table. Now let's flip the coin and look at the other side. Section 3, the symbolic setting, focusing on the history of the Zhongnanhai compound. As we pivot over to the Chinese president's remarks, you can actually feel the entire atmosphere of the text change. The pacing shifts. The language moves away from immediate global crises and quick trade victories, and instead it adopts this really measured, almost storytelling tone. Rather than starting with global policy, he actually starts with the room they're sitting in. He takes the time to explicitly define the setting for the audience, the Zhongnanhai compound. He explains that this is the place where party and central government leaders have worked and lived ever since the founding of the People's Republic of China back in 1949. And going back even further than that, he notes that this space used to be part of the Imperial Garden. And guys, this isn't just a fun piece of trivia. It's a highly deliberate framing technique. By explaining the deep historical context of the setting chosen for these talks, he's actively rooting the current meeting within centuries of authority, tradition, and enduring institutional power. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this specific number, 490. During his remarks, the Chinese president mentions that on their way in, they actually stopped to look at some old trees, pointing out that one of them is 490 years old. He then casually adds that elsewhere in the compound, there are trees that have lived over 1,000 years. Remember earlier when the US president proudly noted they had known each other for 11 or 12 years? Well, here, the Chinese president is subtly introducing a totally different scale of time. It's a pretty powerful rhetorical device, subtly suggesting that the backdrop of their meeting isn't just the events of the current decade, but the grand sweep of centuries. Which brings us right into Section 4, the power of diplomatic symbolism and gestures of goodwill. This right here is a prime example of soft diplomacy at work. While hard policy focuses on the what of trade and security, soft diplomacy relies on cultural exchange and small, personal gestures to achieve foreign policy goals. So, amidst these ancient trees, they looked at some Chinese roses, and the Chinese president announces, "I've agreed to send the seeds for these roses to the president as a gift." And the immediate response from the US president, it's an enthusiastic, "I love that. That's great." Honestly, it's a masterclass in interpersonal connection. In a meeting heavily weighted by international trade and the literal threat of nuclear weapons, the exchange of rose seeds serves as a bridge. It's a humanizing moment that successfully cuts through all the rigid formalities to establish genuine goodwill. Let's move to and see how this builds into our final major theme. Section 5, looking ahead to future visits and the power of reciprocity. Because despite their vastly different rhetorical styles, both speeches ultimately converge on a single shared principle, and that's reciprocity. It is the absolute glue holding these diplomatic exchanges together. If we trace the chronology provided across both of their remarks, we see this really fascinating timeline emerge. We start at the foundation in 1949 with the Zongnanhai compound setup. Then we move forward to roughly 12 years ago, when these two leaders first met and began their relationship. Then, a super crucial anchor point, 2017, when the US hosted at Mar-a-Lago. President Xi explicitly notes he chose this historical compound to reciprocate that 2017 hospitality. That brings us to the present visit, and almost immediately, the timeline extends right into the future, pointing to an upcoming reciprocal visit on or around September 24th. The timeline shows us a continuous, carefully managed cycle of diplomatic hosting. So, the crucial point is how this upcoming visit is framed. The US president makes an explicit promise regarding that planned September 24th visit to the United States. He says, "We will be reciprocal. Like reciprocal trade, you're going to walk away hopefully very impressed." Notice how he brilliantly merges his own preferred style, the language of economic transaction, reciprocal trade, with the softer concept of diplomatic hospitality. He acknowledges the impressive historical setting he just experienced and practically guarantees that the US will match that exact level of impact when it's their turn to host. And that leaves us with a critical question to consider. How do these contrasting communication styles, hard policy versus historical symbolism, shape the future of global diplomacy? We've seen today how two leaders can sit in the exact same 490-year-old garden, and while one speaks of nuclear threats and trade deals, the other speaks of ancient trees and rose seeds. Yet together, they form a complete diplomatic picture. So next time you see a press conference between world leaders, look closely at the screen. Listen to the words. Ask yourself, who is playing the hard policy card, and who is laying the groundwork with soft diplomacy? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep your eyes open to the words behind the world stage.